Joining me now is Maine's independent Senator Angus King. Senator, thank you for joining me this morning.
Glad to be with you, Maura.
Now, you're not in favor of the assault weapon ban, and by many accounts, it's not going to make it out of the Senate. But what do you think is going to happen once that measure hits the Senate floor?
Well, it's hard to tell now, but I don't think it's going to get the votes. My own position on it is based upon the fact that what I'm interested in is what is the functionality of the weapon. In other words, does it shoot further, faster, more frequent bullets? And an assault weapon is really a semi-automatic rifle like thousands of hunting rifles in Maine, but it just looks different. And I don't think, I just think a ban that focuses on what amounts to the appearance of a weapon is really going to be very effective. The other piece, as Mayor Bloomberg pointed out last Sunday, is about 4% of the gun homicides in the country are committed with rifles, whether they're assault rifles or other rifles. And the real issue is handguns, and that's why my focus is on background checks. I think the key thing is to keep guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them. Criminals, people with mental illness that makes them prone to violence, terrorists, and those kinds of things. So I think universal background checks is the single most effective thing we can do, and also controls through controls on gun trafficking, people that buy them legally and then resell them in the black market. I think that's where the attention needs to be focused. There's going to be a big debate on assault weapons. I do disagree with Senator Cruz. I think it's constitutional to do such a thing. The Supreme Court has indicated that pretty strongly, but I just don't think it's going to be that effective. And I'd rather my focus is on what will work, and I think background checks is the most important thing we can do.
Well, you mentioned two things: background checks and restrictions on trafficking. Do you think those measures could get bipartisan support? And if not, what do you think has a realistic chance of getting support from both sides of the aisle?
Well, I think the trafficking bill already has bipartisan support. For example, I know my colleague Susan Collins from Maine is one of the co-sponsors, and I believe that there are some other Republican co-sponsors on that, as well as Democrats. Senator Leahy of Vermont is the prime sponsor. Background checks, I think, is a little harder, but frankly, I don't really understand the argument about that. There's this vague sort of, oh, it's going to turn into a registry and it's going to turn into confiscation. We've had background checks for 15 years, and that hasn't happened. I don't think there's any evidence that it will happen. The trouble is now 40% of the guns that are traded in the country don't go through the background check process, and that's just ridiculous. So I think background checks make sense, and I'm hoping that we're going to be able to do it. Ironically, 10 years ago, the NRA supported universal background checks. They've had a change of heart since then, which I think is really unfortunate. This is a chance for them to step up and really do something for the country and not at all compromise the rights of law-abiding citizens.
Well, let's switch gears, sir, and talk for a minute about the budget. The president met with both sides for 3 days this week to haggle over proposals for 2014. Here's how he summed up his so-called charm offensive.
I think we've had good conversations, but ultimately it's a matter of the House and the Senate, both caucuses getting together and everybody being willing to compromise. We'll see if we can do that.
Everybody being willing to compromise. It's a lot easier said than done. So what now? What does the president need to do, and what do you and your colleagues need to do on the Hill?
Well, the House has already passed a budget. They've put their marker down with the Paul Ryan budget out of the House Budget Committee. The Senate is now working. I was in an 11-hour meeting yesterday of the Senate Budget Committee, and we ended up reporting out a budget that will go to the floor of the Senate next week. And it was along party lines. I participated with the Democrats in the building of that budget. And it really comes down. It's interesting. I sort of woke up this morning realizing what the fundamental differences are. Both parties have come out strongly in favor of examining the tax code for loopholes, deductions, exclusions, and ways that money sort of leaks out of the tax system. Both parties have said they want to do that. The real difference is, what do they want to do with that money? The House budget would take the money generated and provide another tax cut, which would go, I believe, disproportionately to the wealthy. And the budget that we passed out of the committee yesterday would take that money and apply it to deficit reduction. I think that, as an independent, as somebody that's looked at this issue, to me that's a reasonable way to do it, particularly when you look back to 2011 when we started this deficit reduction process. If you add what's been done since 2011 in the way of cuts and revenues, and the budget that was passed yesterday, it comes out 65% cuts and 35% revenues. I think that's a pretty reasonable balance that the American people can support.
All right, Senator Angus King, we're going to have to leave it right there. Thank you for your time this morning, sir.
Thank you. Glad to be with you, Maura.